Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Bulko, and today I'd like to talk about the Druid in Baldur's Gate 3. So in this video, we're going to go through the first few levels of how you might want to build out a Druid, talk about some of the pros and cons of the class, think about some of the spells and of the subclasses available, and then we'll end off with a few multi-classing considerations. So the Druid is arguably one of the more powerful spells, or spellcasters rather, in 5th edition, and one of the more powerful classes in general. And I think in Baldur's Gate 3, they are especially compelling just considering the amount of story options you have. There's also multiple Druid companions that you can get, so this video might be great if you're looking at how you might want to specialize or customize those companions for your own party, and we'll talk about that. So without further ado, let's talk about the roles a Druid can play in your party. So as a full caster, Druids are capable of healing, they're capable of buffing your allies and debuffing enemies. They have great blasting potential, and they have amazing control spells. But on top of all of that, they can also turn into various animal forms, allowing them to scout and even frontline in a pinch, meaning that Druids can fulfill pretty well any role. Probably the weakest they're going to be at is being a single target damage dealer, but they still have options for that as well. And yeah, so Druids can really do whatever you need. And in fact, you can have multiple Druids in the same party doing completely different things and have a very well-balanced party with multiple Druids. So let's look at the ability scores. The nice thing about the ability scores for the Druid, and let's just clear all this nonsense because we don't, what is going on here? Obviously you need the wisdom. You need potentially a little bit of dexterity. Now my scores look better. So you want your wisdom to be at least 16. You want a nice healthy amount of constitution. I would like 16. I would say a 14 in dexterity is great, and then you have a few points left over to round it out. As with many of my companions, I don't need them to have a ton of charisma because they are not going to be talking, and there aren't too many spells that affect charisma, but there are some like Bane and Banishment, for example, affect a charisma save. But other than that, there's not too much. Strength is always nice to have just for being able to jump a little bit and shove at a slightly higher rate than having a negative penalty. Intelligence is also not hugely common, so this is safe to dump. You could even do something like this and get a little bit more bang for buck in terms of being able to jump around. Because we're wearing medium armor as a Druid, having that 14 dex is great, so we'll have a nice high AC with medium armor and a shield, and that'll help us with keeping our concentration on our spells, and then obviously having a bunch in constitution is great. But you don't necessarily need to worry about your physical stats as much as some other classes, because the thing that makes a Druid so fantastic is you are turning into animals if you're really getting into the melee a lot, and then it's going to ignore all your physical stats anyways. So that is something to consider, especially if you are going Circle of the Moon and you plan on turning into animals frequently. You could do some other things and you have lots of points to spare that way, and you could go for more of a skill proficient character that wants the intelligence. You can make those nature checks and do all that kind of thing. And especially if you want to be the character that's talking to all the animals, you could forego some of your physical attributes a little bit and go for more charisma, etc., and have that done. And as always, you could even consider bumping your wisdom even higher at the start of the game so that you could get like a +1 and take a split feat or something like that. Charisma isn't always a great option. Constitution is actually a decent one to get a split feat on. So even just leaving it at 15 and then, playing around with some more points wherever else you want. Maybe you just don't want the penalty or whatever. Because if you take the half feat that gives you proficiency with Constitution saving throws and +1 into Constitution, that's really useful on a caster. It's very good. So worth considering for sure. But for now, we'll just kind of leave it at 16 in Constitution, 16 at Wisdom. This is a very straightforward, solid build that you could have for your Druid. In terms of our skill proficiencies, because we are sort of dumping some of our intelligence and stuff, natured isn't necessarily the best, but we do have that high wisdom. So medicine or something like that would be fine. And once again, this particular build I'm going for isn't going to be about the skill proficiencies so much. So I think we'll leave it there. Now, in terms of cantrips, you get some great options. So if you're not running with a cleric like Shadowheart who has guidance, as long as you have one person that has this, you don't necessarily need it. And I think both Shillelagh and Thornwhip are fantastic. They have some great use cases. Shillelagh lets you use your wisdom for melee attack rolls whenever you're using a staff or a club. So that means that wisdom modifier actually is also what you're using to melee, especially in the early game when you don't have as many spell slots and you potentially need to be up in the front. Thornwhip is a decent range, 9 meters, and it pulls enemies 3 meters closer, which lets you use gravity as a weapon quite consistently, which is really, really fun. And with all your concentration spells later in the game and things like Moonbeam, sometimes just pulling enemies into the fires and the damage zones that you're setting up on the battlefield can be an extra way to make Thornwhip deal an incredible amount of damage. So both of these are nice. Obviously, guidance is fantastic as well. I find the other 3 are not as useful, but you do get another cantrip eventually anyway. So sort of pick your poison in terms of 1 damage cantrip and then guidance, or if you already have guidance, you don't necessarily need this, you can get something else. But we're going to go like this for now, and that will be level 1. All right, so at level 2, you have some big choices to make. And this is also what can make Druid fairly compelling as a multi-class character as well, because you get quite a few specific features that are pretty powerful right away. So obviously you get all these wild shapes, which are neat. Specifically, wild shape cat actually opens up a few unique things in the game. There's little holes and things you can sneak in and some fun little interactions. So having that is really nice. And then obviously you have some cool combat shapes that are going to let you do some different things. So you can do some burrowing, you can do some webbing here, a little control, and then you can incite and attack. And at level 2, these have a decent amount of hit points, and the way wild shape works is these become additional health pools. So you kind of take whatever health you have when you turn into an animal, you get a new hit point pool of 18 hit points, and then once that pool is spent, you go back to whatever you had before. So if you take a hit for 20 damage, let's say some crazy critical hit happens at you, you would go back into Druid form, and then you'd have that 2 damage would spill over into whatever you had in your Druid form, and then you keep going. And this is what makes Druids so powerful, especially early on, is that they have these essentially double the hit points of any other character, which makes them amazing frontliners, especially if they're using these animal shapes, right? The one thing that should be noted, though, is that you gain all the stats of the physical stats, rather, of the animal. And so things like the armor you're wearing doesn't necessarily translate over all the time. And a lot of these different shapes are going to have much lower AC, which means while they are giving you a ton of hit points, you will burn through them relatively quickly because things tend to not miss very often. Whereas sometimes even in Druid form with a shield on and some nice medium armor, you can get fairly high AC very early on. And you can actually be pretty tanky just in the form of just not taking hits at all. So that is something to note. All right, so these circles, these are definitely how you change the Druid build you want. Circle of the Moon is the very classic shape changer Druid. So this is the Druid if you want to be that frontline a little bit more, or be a little bit more of a striker potentially and turn into an animal that's going to do a lot of damage. At level 5, Druids do get the ability to make multiple attacks while in animal form, and this also scales up at level 10 to make 3 attacks. So you do get quite a bit of scaling just by sticking with a Druid in terms of how powerful your animal forms are, and you are unlocking new forms. And Circle of the Moon also gets access to some unique forms, and most importantly, or most significantly, because you have this combat wild shape, you can actually turn into your forms as a bonus action. So this means you could cast a big powerful spell, big high impact spell, and then turn into your beast form. Especially later on, you could do something like a sleet storm or something, especially that you're not having to concentrate on, and then just get right into the melee. So yeah, lots of not sleet storm, ice storm. You have to concentrate on sleet storm. Misspoke there. But yeah, they also come back as a twice per short rest, which is great. So you can use these all the time. Especially at level 2, you turn into a bear with 30 hit points. So twice per short rest, which is effectively like twice. You can get a short rest like roughly per encounter or every other encounter, it feels like. I mean, if you want to just spam rest, there isn't really much stopping you, but at a decent pace, it feels like you always have short rest just laying around. This at level 2, you effectively have like 80 hit points per short rest, which is ridiculous. You can just frontline for days, and not to mention the bear is doing insane damage. Druid is far and above the best level 2 class in the game. They are so powerful. So a big part is just being able to turn into this bear as a bonus action. So this means you can like turn into a bear, get to attack right away if you want, or you could, cast some powerful spell, take an enemy out or heal up an ally or something, and then turn into a bear and then just dive into combat. Circle of the Land is a little bit different than the moon. Obviously, you don't get the ability to turn into animals on a bonus action, but you still get quite a few of the interesting shapes. So as an action, you can still turn into these animals, which still gives you that versatility. It gives you that long enduring, like once you're out of spells, like a wizard that's out of spells is a lot less interesting than a druid that's out of spells, because the worst case scenario, you can just like turn into a spider and like start doing creepy spider things. And that's always fun. But you do also get this natural recovery, which is very similar to the wizard's arcane recovery. So this lets you replenish some of your expended spell slots outside of combat so that you do just have more spells as you're going. And you also gain a cantrip right away. So this is where you could pick up something like that guidance if you wanted. And that would be nice. Additionally, Circle of the Land, though it's not listed right here, does get access to additional spells based on the land they choose. So this is something that's very, very interesting. And there are a few spells that are granted here that are going to be different, not available to druids unless they take a specific land. So the land that you can pick here is circle. You can pick Arctic, coast, desert, forest, grassland, mountain, swamp, or underdark at level 3. And this will give you access to a whole additional spell list. I'm not going to necessarily go over all the spells that you unlock, but some of the big standouts are getting access to the spell Haste is really nice. So this is if you are an Arctic or grassland druid, you'll get access to Haste eventually. Mountain will eventually give you access to Lightning Bolt, which is a really powerful and fun spell to use, which you cannot get any other way. Swamp gives you the most spells that you don't get on any druid. Swamp and Underdark, rather, both give you access to a huge pile of spells. So Swamp would give you things like Darkness, Acid Arrow, Stinking Cloud, Vampiric Touch, and Cloud Kill eventually. Underdark gives you Misty Step, Web, Stinking Cloud, Gaseous Form, Greater Invisibility, and Cloud Kill. So a lot of variety in both like debuffs and AoE, some little bit of damage as well, and things like Cloud Kill, that's way later in the game. So things like that are worth considering. Desert also, I just want to give a shout out to the Hypnotic Pattern. So especially if you want to be that controller, you have a nice wisdom spell that you can get access to. So a lot of the druid spells are like Entangle, or they're creating difficult terrain, which is great for locking enemies down in terms of like their position. But against ranged enemies or against some of those high strength enemies that are harder to entangle, having access to something like a Hypnotic Pattern can be really, really nice. And last but certainly not least, we have the Circle of Spores Druid, which is arguably the most unique And this is, I think, on my second playthrough, I'm going to have my main character be a Circle of Spores Druid because I love the flavor. So Circle of Spores is essentially, if you want to be a fungus necromancer, this is the subclass. They have some really cool, unique abilities. So in addition to some of the animal shapes, you still have some of that utility as regular druids. You have this really fun symbiotic entity thing that you get, which gives you a pile of temporary hit points, 4 times your druid level, I believe it is. And then it lets you deal an additional d6 of necrotic damage with all your attacks, including unarmed attacks. So, monk fun combo here. And it lets you use this halo of spores as a reaction. And it doubles the damage of this when you have your symbiotic entity up. You also get Bone Chill as just like a fun, like creepy ranged necrotic damage. It's fantastic against undead. But this symbiotic entity has some really, really cool things. It gives you this, it uses your wild shape charges and gives you like this buffer of hit points to make you a little bit tanky, because normally turning into a whole animal gives you this massive pile of hit points. So you still get like a little bit of that, but in addition, you're doing a little bit more damage with your attacks. And there are some cool combos, specifically if you're like 2-weapon fighting. This is really, really good. Or if you're, multiclassing like a monk, like I said, and you're making a whole bunch of attacks around, this is really cool. So there are some cool combos that you can get with this. And eventually you also get access to unique spells as a Circle of the Spores Druid. And specifically, you get access to zombies and things like that. So you get to raise an army of fungus zombies to take over the world. To save Baldur's Gate. And that is fantastic. So really cool flavor, lots of cool things going on with the Circle of Spores. But because this is Halcyon and because I think it's thematic, we're going to build out this particular character as a Circle of the Moon. So going for that shape-shifting druid. And because we haven't talked about it yet, we're also going to talk about the first level spells. And spells are obviously huge when it comes to the druid as a full spellcaster. So right away, this is just the recommended, and I'm going to take away a couple of these, but we'll leave these ones and we'll talk about them. So obviously, Healing Word is fantastic. This is your bonus action heal. It's great for picking up allies, or just if you have a free bonus action, which you also often do, you kind of just like keep the healing flowing a little bit to stop people from going down. Because unlike in regular 5th edition, there's a kind of a really nice house rule that I know some of the people I've talked to are like, yes, I'm using that in my own game as a DM. And it's the idea that when you get knocked down in Baldur's Gate 3, when you get picked back up with something like Healing Word, you lose your action for the turn you get picked up. So there is something to be said about preventative healing, and Healing Word as a bonus action means you can kind of top people up, prevent them from going down by that one extra little point of damage or two, so that you don't lose your action, and that can be really, really beneficial. In terms of sort of level 1 blasting, like your only damaging spell is Ice Knife. Early on in the game, it's not necessarily hugely impactful to have a damaging spell, but it does do a decent amount of damage, and it has this little explosion, and it leaves an ice surface, so there's a little bit of AoE there, and the ice explodes even if you miss, so that does a good amount of damage, kind of guaranteed, which is nice. So I like having that to finish off like a couple enemies that are near each other that are maybe a little bit lower. Entangle is a standout spell, one of the best controlling spells in the game. It slows down enemies kind of no matter what, and entangling is very, very powerful. So the entity can't move, so you can hold those melee enemies completely still, and it gives attack rolls against that target advantage, which is massive. So this is going to really increase your chance to hit. And then obviously they're also getting disadvantage on their attack rolls and dexterity saving throws. So it's a huge, huge debuff in terms of, completely neutering their chance to hit you while completely buffing your chance to hit them. It means things like your Sacred Flame on your Shadow Heart is actually going to land for once. It's so good. It is very good. It is a strength save, which is worth noting. A lot of those melee enemies that you really want to stop from getting to your front line will have a good strength saving throw. However, even just the difficult terrain is often enough to force the AI to waste at least one action using a dash. And if you can, pretty well guaranteed 2 to 3 enemies to waste their turn just trying to get to you, that's very worth one action and one level 1 spell slot. So in terms of action economy, a fantastic spell. Speak with Animals is great. And once again, these are prepared spells. These are not spells you need to know. So you get all of these and can just use them. I kind of probably should have started with that. But in ones like you kind of generally want to have available, obviously Speak with Animals is fine, but you can just put this on. It's a ritual spell. And then you don't need to keep it prepared, so we don't need to worry about it, but you definitely want this around. Fairy Fire is nice. It's a dex save. It gives advantage on attack rolls against enemies, and you can kind of pull things out of invisibility. I do find Entangle, since they're both concentration, Entangle kind of does a lot of the things you want Fairy Fire to do. So a lot of times this will feel a little bit better. Thunderwave is worth for sure in terms of having another kind of blastery AoE that does a decent amount of damage. Fog Cloud is nice. It completely blocks line of sight, so you can put it on the back line and force those archers and casters to sort of waste their turn repositioning, or completely just like put it on your own party, and they will have to run across the entire map in order to get into an area where they can actually attack you. So there's lots of utility there. Create Water is fantastic. You can combine it later on with something like Call Lightning and do an obscene amount of damage. Or if you're a Circle of the Land and you're a mountain druid, you can combine it with Lightning Bolt just for shenanigans. Lots of cool combos with that. A few other notable ones. Longstrider lasts until long rest. So once again, you could just turn that on, throw it on somebody, and then take it off your prepared spell list. You can just hit K at any time in the game and just swap spells out as you want. Same with something like Goodberry. You could just make a few Goodberries and keep them around. These are essentially like free potions. You can just give them out to everybody in your party, and they can kind of just munch on them with spare bonus actions to kind of stay topped up. It is a decent amount of healing for a single spell slot, so might be worth just casting one and leaving it at that. Enhanced Leap is pretty cool. The tripling the jumping distance is pretty decent, and if you combine this with a feat like Athletic, like on my Lae'zel, for example, my frontline fighter has athletics, and she uses her own psionic triple jump. You can jump an obscene distance, like across entire battlefields. It is worth considering as well. There's also some charms and things like that, animal friendships and charms, which you can use depending on the situation, but those are also just bring in sort of as needed because you are a prepared spellcaster. So unlike wizards and bards and sorcerers and things, you just get to have all of these. But in terms of what you might want to run to kind of be well-rounded, I might run something like this, and this will give me a lot of options in terms of like some AoE damage, can kind of defensive, crowd control, sort of hide behind my own like smoke bomb, some entangling, and then there's a lot of utility, create or destroy water, and then sort of depending on the situation, you could even swap Thunderwave in and out, and then always just having that healing word around is great. So yeah, that is level 2 and some of the first level spells. Let's go on to level 3. All right. So at level 3, the main thing we're going to be talking about here is obviously the second level spells. And I think there are 2 standouts that are, above and beyond worth taking and always having around. And we'll kind of talk about those. And I think those would be the 2 I would drop for them. So specifically, we would want Spike Growth and Moonbeam. These are incredibly useful spells that have so much power. You could potentially drop Entangle at this point because Spike Growth is probably doing a very similar thing, but it is up to you. I mean, you can keep both because they're both still fantastic and have potentially different uses. Spike Growth has a much larger size. It is, we have a 3 meter radius versus a 6 meter radius, so this one's huge. And it halves movement, but it also does a ton of damage as people move through it. So not only is it often wasting like 1 to 2 turns completely as they try to power through spike growth, but it also is going to do tons and tons of damage, and there is no saving throw. It just happens. So it's generally guaranteed damage. You can put it in a choke point, and there's multiple encounters where you just throw this in a door and then just like back off, and you win the encounter with a single spell because they just have to walk through it and they all die. So spike growth, completely fantastic spell. And another standout spell that actually scales very well and does good work is Moonbeam. So Moonbeam does 2d10 radiant damage, which is a decent chunk for a second level spell slot. But it has a really small radius that's usually easy to hit, 2 sort of adjacent enemies. But the nice thing about it is it's really easy to position it in such a way where even if your front line is engaged with the enemy, you can hit your enemies without hurting your ally. So it's kind of nice to position. And the way Moonbeam works in Baldur's Gate 3 is it'll do the 2d10 damage as soon as you cast it, and then it also does that damage as soon as they start their turn again. So it's kind of like Cloud of Daggers here, but it's a little bit smaller, quite a bit smaller. And it does have a saving throw, so they can reduce the damage to half, which is still going to be decent. The thing that's nice, though, this is radiant damage, and there are plenty of enemies where being able to do some radiant damage is very, very nice to have. So that's kind of a point in Moonbeam's favor. And then the really nice thing with Moonbeam is on subsequent turns, you can recast it without using a spell slot, essentially. So there's a little window, a conditional window icon that pops up in the bottom right that lets you recast Moonbeam. And so you can reposition it, do the damage again. And a lot of times you can feel like you're sort of blasting the whole encounter with only using a single spell slot. Just by every turn with your druid, you're just hitting 2 different targets or just finishing off a low target. Next turn, you're finishing off another target or moving it to a new group of targets. And this can do a ton of damage, and it's really nice to kind of snipe. It has a fantastic 18-meter range in terms of casting, so you can move it all over the battlefield, reposition it super easy, and it is definitely a standout spell in my experience. And then obviously as a prepared spellcaster, there's lots of things in terms of depending on the encounter. Like if you want to pass without trace, like if you want to be that stealth situation, you just put this on, give everybody the buff. It lasts until a long rest, and you just go forth, be sneaky. Flaming Sphere is a decent little spell. It does light a lot of things on fire. You can move the sphere around and bump it into things. It is a bit of a mini summon, so this is a really fun spell. Hold Person is really powerful. It also scales nicely with spell slots. It is super devastating to land, so also worth taking. There are some cool combinations with Flameblade. There's some builds that you can do where you're essentially taking a few levels to get access to Flameblade and then having some sort of way to make multiple attacks and take advantage of it. So this is a spell that's worth considering as well. Lots of things. Spells that are like Lesser Restoration and Enhanceability also are worth noting. Just the fact that you're a prepared spellcaster in the situations that are a little bit rare where you kind of want these things, you potentially can just put them on, and then if you catch some sort of lingering disease that just you keep failing your saving throw and you want to just kind of get rid of it, you can do that, put it on, get rid of it, and then trade it back out. So yeah, lots of flexibility there. I find Barkskin is you usually have like 18 AC by level 3. I found pretty easily with a druid, so not necessarily needed. It is kind of nice. You could put this on a character, so like a different character, but it is concentrations. You have better things to be concentrating on, like spike growth, because why give somebody like an extra maybe 10 or 15% less chance to be hit when you can just stop like 6 enemies from even getting to your party. So yeah, that is sort of my overall thoughts for those level 2 spells, and we'll go on to some multi-class options. So when it comes to multi-classing the druid, there are a few things to consider. First of all, druids are a class that, like staying Druid for a few different reasons. One is they have a lot of abilities that are unique. So specifically their wild shapes and the enhancements in terms of getting additional attacks. So if you want to get to those 3 attacks with your wild shape, you need to be level 10 in Druid, which does mean that potentially level 10 is like a nice place to think about. And then if you can take 2 levels of another class, you could potentially unlock some powerful combinations. So something like Monk could let you become maybe a little bit more of like a Druid Monk, might give you some options for some melee combos. But there are even just taking a few levels of Druid and then going more into Monk for like all your attacks and all your cool Monk things, would let you take advantage, like as a Circle of Spore Druids, doing that extra necrotic damage. But you're also losing how many temporary hit points you're getting on your unique Circle of Spore ability. So it won't last as long, and those hit points are going to sort of fall off earlier. Obviously, if you are adding Jaheira to your party, you take some levels in Fighter, because that is canon that, you know, Jaheira is a fighter druid. So you take the 2 levels in Fighter to get your action surge. You just go the rest in Druid, and you're having a great time. You're just being a plate mail wearing warrior of nature, and it's awesome. You could even maybe go a little bit more into Fighter if you wanted to, and forego turning into animals as much. But yeah, up to you. In terms of some of the other things, I do think a couple levels in Cleric is worth considering, specifically Tempest Cleric. So Druids do have access to a lot of cool lightning powers and abilities and things like that. You could take that 2-level dip for the Channel Divinity that lets you maximize your lightning damage, and that is something you could consider. But other than that, I think Druids as a multi-class are not necessarily one of the better multi-classing classes. They are sort of a full caster that has unique features that really do reward you for going very deep into the line. Paladin is kind of an interesting one, because once again, you could just take 2 levels of Paladin and stay Druid, and then that would let you start Divine Smiting, which is kind of neat, especially if you are going Circle of Spores, where you're not going to be turning into an animal, but instead getting this big bucket of temporary hit points. It lets you be a little bit more on the front line, and it would really augment your ability to be a striker. And you don't necessarily the thing that would be kind of awkward, though, is you're not getting that multiple attacks. So you would potentially want to be like a 2-weapon fighter to take advantage of your bonuses for Circle of Spore Druid. You could go like all the way to 5 levels of Paladin to get the second attack for being a Paladin. However, at that point, you're foregoing a lot of the benefits of being a Druid. But because you're not really focusing on your wild shapes as much, losing some of that isn't as bad. So you would potentially have, like, you know, up to 5 levels of Paladin, and then the rest in Druid would give you a lot of the really powerful and cool Druid abilities. Like, you would still get access to all your undead summons as a Circle of Spore Druid, and then you could still have some of the cool Paladin features. You'd have a lot more smites than a regular Paladin would, and you'd have like this undead army of, you know, it'd be kind of a cool build and sort of a cool fantasy of, especially like you could go for the nature themed Paladin with the Druid, and you have like this like fungal knight leading this army of zombies. It would be fun. I would play that at the table. I think that would be a fun. Nobody would like you at the table, though. Let's be honest, because nobody wants to play with a player that has like 12 actions on their turn, just rolling like a fistful of d20s to like figure out like how your zombies are doing things. But in Baldur's Gate 3, it is fun to do. I guess unless you are playing with your friends in multiplayer, and then having a huge summoner army is also still kind of a jerk thing to do, because your turns will take forever. But yeah, that is the Druid. Once again, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments if you have any anything to say about druids or any questions, I will do my best to answer you. In a lot of my other videos, I've had people making lots of questions about different builds and things, and I always try to answer everybody's questions about what they think they should be doing with their particular character. And I appreciate all the support and comments I've been getting so far. So hopefully the PS5 people are finally in and enjoying the game, and I will catch you in the next one.